Hey, welcome back to Philosophy on Human Nature. We are on the last unit of the course on social power and human behavior. And today we're actually going to talk about two different thinkers who are both somewhat related to each other. We're going to talk about G.H. Mead and B.F. Skinner on human behavior. So we're not going to go super in depth with the background because we have a lot to get through. But real quick, G.H. Mead was mostly doing his thing during the turn of the century. He was an American philosopher and social psychologist who was based out of the University of Chicago. And if you're a sociology major, you're probably familiar with Mead, but he's the founding figure of a sociological school of thought known as symbolic interactionism. And symbolic interactionism, the basic crux of this framework is that it attempts to study symbols and collective meaning through communicative interactions between people and understands meanings and symbols as ultimately the product of these interactions, not sort of coming out of other sources of. But Mead was also influenced by influenced pragmatism, as well as social behaviorism, which is what we're going to talk about here today. B.F. Skinner, on the other hand, was mostly doing his writings during the mid to late 20th century. And he's an American psychologist based out of Harvard University. If you're a psychology major, you're probably very much familiar with Skinner. He's kind of gotten out of popularity as of recent, and you can probably imagine why once we talk about him here in a second. But Skinner has nonetheless had a very profound impact on psychology, and he's a founding figure of what he calls radical behaviorism. And Skinner's own brand of behaviorism was developed from another psychologist named John B. Watson, who developed a methodological behaviorism. And according to Watson, methodological behaviorism refers to a kind of a research program or a kind of study which maintains that psychology should not be concerned with studying private mental states or private mental events. So it doesn't really matter what's going on inside your head. Instead, we should study things that are observable, which is behavior, outward behavior, right? This differed obviously from other psychological schools like psychoanalysis, whose object of study was, what we would call internal or private mental states, using words like consciousness or the unconscious and stuff like that. So behaviorists reject that framework, instead settle for studying human behavior. Okay. So going a little bit more depth into Mead's social behaviorism. So according to Mead, social behaviorism is the study of human experience from the vantage of social conduct rather than from introspection. So this is very similar to what we just talked about here a second ago. When you study human experience, you should study the practices, the movements, the comportments, the communicative processes, the interactions that humans do, right? Instead of studying human nature from, this idea of the soul or from this idea of the individual, right? Isolated from his or her social environment. And for Mead specifically, most behaviorists don't accept this concept of the mind. They think the mind is a very abstract and nebulous concept that doesn't really explain anything. But for Mead, he does have a concept of the mind, but it's very unorthodox. And for me, the mind isn't something that's inside of our heads. It's not something that's just given to us. Instead, what he calls the mind is something that emerges through our social interactions or interactions with the environment, right? And for me, he understands interpersonal interaction through what he would consider to be the mutual exchange of symbols. And symbols you can think of as words, as pictures, as gestures, all these things that are meant to convey meaning. So for me, the mind isn't this incorporeal substance, all right? It's not like a soul or a spirit inside of our heads or inside of our bodies that animate us, like Descartes would maintain. And it's also not just reducible to neurophysiological processes. So he's not a strict materialist or physicalist. Instead, he wants to argue that what we call the mind is an ongoing social process. If humans don't have that sort of social fabric or that social matrix within what that structures our social environments, then we can't really say that we have a mind in the sense that Mead wants to suggest. So he writes here, quote, behaviorism in this wider sense is simply an approach to the study of the experience of the individual from the point of view of his conduct, particularly but not exclusively the conduct as it is observed by others. Skinner, on the other hand, he calls his brand of behaviorism radical behaviorism. And it's maybe an apt designation because Skinner's is a behaviorism certainly a little bit more radical than Mead's, excuse me. So Skinner wants to suggest that, to the extent that we can study private mental states, we can only study them as behaviors, so as responses to external stimuli. So something like consciousness or the soul or the mind for Skinner is something that psychology can't say much about. It's probably for Skinner, it's probably not something that really even maybe exists. We can only really study these mental private states as reported to us, and they're reported to us because it's a response to an external stimuli, right? So again, human behavior can't be explained in terms of unobservable phenomena for behaviorists. So this framework has roots within Hobbesian materialism and English utilitarianism. We did talk about Hobbes' materialism in our very first lecture, and once we start talking more about Skinner, you can probably see the familiarities with Hobbes' conception of human nature is fundamentally as a matter of matter, right? You can understand human behaviors in terms of pain and pleasure and desires and aversions, and not in terms of stuff like the soul. So again, for Skinner's research program, for Skinner's understanding of psychology, he's in line with Watson in thinking that psychology should content itself to the study of human behavior, but not the sort of internal processes of the mind. Even though Skinner wasn't as dismissive of maybe private mental states as Watson was, Skinner and Watson nonetheless thought that the mind is sort of a black box. Even if there is stuff going on inside of there, there's not much that we can say or do about it. And to the extent, again, that we can say or do something about it, then it becomes behavior. It becomes responses to external stimuli. So key concepts, and if you studied psychology, then you're probably already familiar with these. There's this idea of stimulus and response, or the stimulus response chain, right? So behaviors can be explained in terms of organisms' responses to external stimuli, whether that's good or bad or somewhere in between. And then that organism has a response to that stimuli, right? And it's a constant sort of feedback loop that goes over and over again. And for Skinner, you can control stimuluses. You can control stimuli, which means you can also control responses to a certain extent, right? And for Skinner, he developed this research program called operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is a very sort of conscious way to try to condition organisms to either to encourage a certain behavior or to discourage a certain behavior. Right? So you do this through positive and negative reinforcement. Positive negative reinforcement doesn't mean rewards or punishments. Positive reinforcement means that you're trying to condition an organism to develop a certain practice or to develop a certain behavior. And in negative reinforcement, you're trying to do the opposite. You're trying to discourage a certain practice or discourage a certain behavior. Now you can go about that by providing rewards and punishments, right? So Skinner himself conducted this very famous experiment which is known as Skinner's box, where he put a rat inside of this box, and every time a rat would push, I should probably look this up before this video, but I think it was something like when the rat pushed a button or a green button, then it would dispense food, and then if it pushed the wrong button or if it did something else, then there's this platform under him that would shock the rat, right? And through this experiment, Skinner was able to get the rat to establish practices or to encourage practices of pushing something with the expectation that there will be a reward, which is food, and to discourage another practice, which is to push this other button where you'll get shot. Right. Okay. So we'll start with Mead first. So for Mead, in the readings that you read, he wants to ask the question of how does the self emerge as an object, right? Um, and he takes on again a sort of social scientific or a psychological, social psychological perspective, and he wants to answer this question through child social development, because it is through child development that we ourselves develop a sense of self, right? And he makes this distinction between a play versus a game. Now, you can think of the play, the playing and gaming, as you would call it, in terms of three stages, right? So the first stage, which you didn't really talk as much about these readings, is the preparatory stage. In the preparatory stage, excuse me, is when the child starts to develop the self in the sense that the child can imitate the behavior of other people around him or her, right? So, if I'm sure you all have toddlers in your family, but if you've interacted with children who are 2 or younger, they'll often do things that imitate the adults around them, right? So if the child's father's on the phone, then she might go and then pick up a toy phone and do what her father is doing, right? Um, it's in this stage that we start to learn how to comport ourselves in a similar manner to the adults or the other organisms that surround us, right? The second stage is the play stage, and this is when the child starts to the imitations of the child start to take on a more sophisticated role, right? So the child begins to role play. And for Mead, role playing is when we adopt the attitude of a specific other, right? Um, and in this case, an example as you can think of is, a mother, a doctor, a soldier, etc. So again, this is the part of our childhood, which I'm sure many of us have had experiences ourselves with this when we were children. Uh, but in our society, in a gendered society, for example, girls are encouraged to role play as mothers. So they'll buy like a dollhouse or they'll have like a baby doll, and they'll sort of play around with it, kind of pretending to be a mother. And by that same token, in our society, we encourage boys to be combative and warrior-like. So boys will buy toy guns, they'll buy toy army helmets, and they'll play around like they're a soldier, at war or something. Um, Obviously, those forms of play are not inherent to the genders, but rather the sort of the gender roles that we have in our society encourage that kind of play. Because again, playing for me is a crucial part of our development because that's how we learn to have a sense of self in cohesion with our communities. Um, So then in play, it's spontaneous again, right? You're not playing a game. You're not playing under a set of rules that constrain your actions. You're just playing the child is experimenting, is being spontaneous, is seeing what it's like to adopt this role. So again, this is the state, unlike the preparatory stage where the child is just mimicking the behavior of others, this is the stage where the child starts to learn what it means to take on these social roles. But these social roles aren't understood to be governed by rules, like as in a game, right? Okay, so then finally we get to the game stage, and the game stage is when the child learns to internalize the roles of all others involved with them, and also learns to internalize the rules of playing in a certain way. Um, So the difference between a game and gaming and playing is that when you're gaming, you're acting in a social role uh, with the knowledge of the other social roles that are involved with you, and also in knowledge of the rules that constrain your actions. So unlike the play stage, the game stage is more ordered and it's more organized. Um, and for me, this is a stage where the child learns to become a self-conscious member of the community to which he or she belongs. Um, and for me, what all the sort of rules that are involved in the game, as well as the rules of the game, um, there emerges this symbolic unity, as you call it, and the symbolic unity is known as the generalized other. Um, so the generalized other is the means by which we comprehend our social roles, right? So if you're, an example of a game is like baseball, right? Um, if I'm the pitcher, then I'm comporting myself. I'm acting in a way that's not only conscious of my particular role as a pitcher, not only conscious of the roles of others in this limited sense, but I'm conscious of the whole thing as a whole, right? As a set of roles, as a schedule of social roles, and an act relative to this broad generalized other. Um, and a common way to describe this generalized other is sort of a set of common expectations that we all share by virtue of participating in this game. So if I'm playing baseball, I trust that all the others around me share the same assumptions about the rules of the game and the social rules that each person is supposed to fulfill. Um, and I think for me, he partly sort of personalizes this phenomenon as an other, as a generalized other, because you can also think of it as an imagined audience, right? Because when we're playing games, if I'm a pitcher playing baseball, in that case, I'd have a real audience, just the people watching the game. But even if we don't have an audience in the stadium, we have this imagined audience because we act in a way realizing that the sort of the rules, the expectations of the game, in some senses, are watching us and are keeping us accountable, right? That we practice our social roles in the way that's proper to the rules of the game. And for Mead, he didn't necessarily. He briefly alluded to these in the reading, but excuse me, briefly alluded to this in the reading. But for him, he wants to suggest that social institutions are ultimately structured as games, right? So our legal systems, our political systems, our electoral systems, even to some extent our economic systems, there are roles by which we fulfill our place within certain social roles. Um, and in each of these games, they have a generalized other that keeps us sort of accountable to fulfilling our end of the game, so to speak, right? Um, So he has a quote here, quote, "What goes to make up the organized self is the organization of the attitudes which are common to the group. A person is a personality because he belongs to a community, because he takes over the institutions of that community into his own conduct. He takes its language as medium by which he gets his personality. And then through a process of taking the different roles that all the others furnish, he comes to get the attitude of the members of the community," unquote. But for me, so he has this very behavioristic account of how the self develops with through play and through games. But for me, he doesn't think the self can be purely reduced to what he calls the social organization of attitudes. Um, so for me, there are what he calls two moments of the self, right? So what on the one hand he calls it the I, and the other part he calls it the me. Um, And the me is the part of the self that basically takes on social roles. And it takes on social roles by internalizing the organized attitudes of others. And the thing about the me is that it's specific to certain situations. So, for example, the way that my me, that's really hard to say, the way that my me operates within a certain group, like my family or my friend group, is going to be different from how the me operates within the workplace, right? So the me allows us to sort of inhabit multiple social roles in light of the particular games that structure those social roles. Um, and the me allows us to navigate these complex social settings. So, if in this can these games or these sort of institutions can either have conscious, or explicit rules like don't steal, don't murder, don't drive past 85 miles an hour. But also these rules of the games can also include things like norms, common norms that everyone implicitly agrees to sort of uphold or oppose of the community. The I, on the other hand, is the part of the self that responds to the me. Um, throughout our different iterations within these social roles, there still needs to be a sense of continuity and contiguity within ourselves between these various moments, right? And so the I functions to do precisely that. And the I is also, for me, the source of our creativity and the source of our own original responses to different social situations. So, for example, if I'm a judge in a court case, I have a particular social role. The me of my me is operates through my social role as being a judge, as someone who adjudicates different claims, right? But obviously, my work as a judge can't be purely explained in terms of my social role. There's also a part of myself that can respond to uh, um, the demands of my social role. And that's precisely what the I does, right? Um, so you can think of the I and the me as sort of two legs in different parts, right? So the me is sort of one foot out. It's the sort of leg that is steeped within social situations that navigates these different social roles. And the other leg is in, and that leg of the I is the part of the self that can respond to these different social roles in a way that's creative, in a way that's original, right? If you shouldn't think of the I and the me as two discrete things. For me, they're very much dialectically interwoven with each other. Um, what that means that the me relies on the I and the I relies on the me, and me calls them two moments because the interplay between the I and the me is always constant, right? It's not like, oh, on Tuesdays I act as a me and on Wednesday I act as an I. It's not like that because in any specific instance, the I and the me are always negotiating and communicating with each other. Okay, so I know that was quick, but that was Mead, and now we're moving on to Skinner. And Skinner's conception of behaviorism is similar, but also radically different in more than one way. Um, and for Skinner, his behaviorism has more of a normative component to it, right? And Skinner wants to argue that behaviorism rests on a perfectionistic philosophy of human nature. Um, Perfectionism is basically this idea that if you accept that human nature is not fixed, that human nature is not inherently good or inherently bad, then what that would imply is that human nature can be improved, it can be perfected, right? um, and Skinner writes about this, but perfectionistic philosophy or perfectionistic understanding of human nature can trace its lineage back to Enlightenment era humanism. So again, in the Kant lecture that we talked about a few weeks ago, we talked about how the Enlightenment was this intellectual movement predicated on this understanding that we can, govern society rationally, among other things, right? Um, and for Kant, he describes Enlightenment as humankind's overcoming of its self-incurred immaturity, right? With this understanding that humans can think for themselves through the public use of reason. And Skinner's is understanding of human nature. Humanism is similar, but he kind of wants to do away with some of the more nebulous conceptions within Enlightenment era perfectionism, which we'll get into here in a second. Um, so for Skinner, because he sees the world fundamentally in terms of stimuli and responses, in terms of control and reaction, in terms of different determinations that influence our conduct or that influences our behavior, our actions, um, he thought that this has a lot of potential for what we'd call social engineering, right? So for Skinner, he thinks that we should, in some, well, not in some senses, he thought that we can basically just rationally plan society, that we can rationally control society in a way that maximizes good outcomes or positive consequences, right? So to do that, scientists will need to develop techniques to improve environmental conditions of groups. And if you can successfully improve the environmental conditions of groups, then that would mean that those groups' cultural patterns would also improve. Um, so in this sense, improving human nature is a lot like designing and conducting an experiment, right? You control for something and then see if there is a sort of consequence that follows from it, right? Or rather, if there's a positive consequence that follows from it in this case. And if it succeeds, then you continue doing that technique. And obviously, if it fails, then you move on and you do another technique or you do another method or another experiment until you can successfully change cultural patterns toward a more positive outcome. So again, basically, we should replicate scientific methods to control society. Um, and a few years before he wrote this essay, Skinner published a very well-known work of science fiction called Walden 2. And it's a book about this utopian community that governs itself through these behaviors principles that Skinner lays down. And one of the more sort of philosophically interesting aspects of this text is that Skinner wants to reject this idea of free will. And he wants to reject it on two counts. And the first is that he wants to reject it descriptively. So description means how things are, simply. You can think of it as fact, in a sense. Um, and in terms of fact, or in descriptive terms, a behaviorist would say that free will is an illusion because we're all essentially just products of our environmental conditionings and our environmental determinations, right? Um, so everything about me, everything about you, everything about this lecture that I'm doing is ultimately just a product of an amalgamation of determinations that happened in our past lives that led up to this moment. But within this whole sort of patchwork of determinations or of cause and effect, there's nothing within that that can suggest that we did things out of our own free will. Um, and to the extent that something called free will exists, again, we can't really observe it and we can't really study it. We can only study things in terms uh, of determinations. And the Skinner wants to also reject free will on a normative basis. And you can think of normativity as how things ought to be, right? And a normative rejection of free will would maintain that, if human nature can be improved, if we can control for the determinations of human nature, if we can control for the environmental factors that produce the actions or the conduct of humans, then free will is an obstacle to that project. Because if we want to give people the freedom to do whatever they want, then that's not stable for trying to perfect human nature, right? So not only does Skinner want to suggest that free will is descriptively wrong, he wants to suggest that it's also normatively dangerous. So, Skinner's behaviorism is very much in opposition to the existentialists, which we've read a couple of existentialists in this course. Because the existentialists are all about freedom and authenticity and sort of defining your essence, as Sartre would say, by first understanding the sort of how your existence plays out in the world. And Skinner, he just thought that was a bunch of philosophical nonsense. Basically, he's not compelled by the idea that there is free will, and even if free will does exist, he's not compelled by the understanding that it's even desirable, right, for a rational and for a good society. So he has this quote here, quote, "The immediate practical implication of a science of behavior has a familiar ring, for it recalls the doctrine of human perfectibility of 18th and 19th century humanism. A science of man shares the optimism of that philosophy and supplies striking support for the working faith that men can build a better world, and through it, better men," unquote. So then Skinner also considers various objections to this understanding of a perfectionistic philosophy, right? And I believe this is section 2 or section 3 of the text. And the first objection that he wants to consider is, we're not against improving human nature, but the improvement of human nature should proceed organically. We shouldn't do it through control, and because ultimately we can't change opinions that way. Skinner wants to respond by saying, well, actually we can change opinions through control and through indoctrination. It's funny because he doesn't really see indoctrination as an inherently negative thing. Indoctrination can be good for Skinner. And For Skinner, we're actually always indoctrinated. Our opinions are always controlled by external factors. So he uses the example of the early Christian church. A lot of the reason why Christianity was so successful for Skinner is because it had very sophisticated techniques of indoctrination, right? But also, like even on a lower level, we're also constantly indoctrinated through advertising. Our opinions are always determined by public relations. Our opinions are always determined by all of these of media, right? Um, and even at the sort of interpersonal level, people go to psychotherapy. People get sort of counseling because they want to be re-indoctrinated to be a functioning human being, right? So for Skinner, he's like, well, um, people's opinions do change, and they actually change pretty easily. So that's not any objection that would refute this behavior as framework that I'm offering. Well, then a second objection that Skinner then considers is, well, humans will always resist efforts to improve them because, ultimately people don't like being controlled. And if people became aware of the fact that they're being controlled, then they're going to resist that by any means necessary. Um, so it's this understanding. In some ways, the existentialists kind of believe in this, right? Because we always have this core of freedom or this core of authenticity that can never fully be subsumed within a social configuration. Um, and for Skinner, he wants to again argue that free will doesn't exist descriptively. So humans are always controlled, whether they're aware of it or not. Um, Again, humans were just the product of these various determinations that make up who we are, and there's nothing within us that defines who we are, like a soul or like a free will, outside of those determinations. So what that means is that the real question here should be about the techniques or the methods of control that we employ, but not about control itself. And um, Skinner does concede, though, yes, humans tend to react negatively to inept or cruel forms of control. No one likes being beaten around. No one likes being imprisoned. No one likes being told what to do in a very authoritarian manner. But nonetheless, humans do like being controlled when it's covert, when it's subtle, when it doesn't harm them in a very dramatic way. And Skinner does, I think, get a lot of flack for kind of forwarding this worldview, but Skinner is always about trying to implement more humane techniques of human control. He thought that we should eventually do away with punishment altogether. We should purely try to control human nature through rewards and through positive incentives, right? And he was very much against things like torture and all that kind of stuff. And the third objection that he considers is that even if we were to develop these sophisticated forms of control, there always remains the possibility of corruption. There always remains the possibility of self-interested individuals using these techniques of control for their own benefit. And Skinner, I think, partly kind of recognizes this possibility, but he says that we don't need these people in positions of power and control to be perfect or to be saints even. What we need to do is we need to work on the environment to make it such that even if they do act on self-interest, their actions ultimately would or we work to make it such that their actions would benefit everyone within that society. So for Skinner, if there's a problem, it's always about just, well, we just need better forms of control. We need more sophisticated forms of control. We need we need better techniques. Okay. So then he proceeds to talk about freedom. And again, for Skinner, for him, he thinks that human dignity isn't about respecting people's freedom in this sort of philosophically ubiquitous sense, right? But instead about pursuing methods of control that are humane and non-coercive. Um, so think about the example of trying to kind of convince someone to stop stealing, right? So let's say there's someone that keeps stealing your pencil every day. We have two options. Option one is that you can take a more coercive route and just issue commands, don't steal or else. And those commands are often backed up by the threat of coercion, right? If you don't stop stealing, then you will be arrested and you will be in prison, or even on a more minor level. If you don't stop stealing, then I'm going to stop being friends with you and I'm going to tell the teacher and you'll get disciplined by going to detention or something like that, right? Um, so that's one option. The second option is that you can appeal to their reason. And this is kind of what Kant likes to do, right? Well, imagine you can do this by saying like, well, imagine if someone stole your pencil every day, how would that make you feel? Or how would our society look like if people just stole things because they wanted to and not try to get things in a more proper way? Um, and for Skinner, he wants to say that, yes, although option two is preferable because it's more humane, both options are ultimately geared towards the same outcome. We're trying to change the offender's actions. They're trying to change the offender's conduct. Uh, and in either options you pursue, we're sort of influencing the environmental determinations of the person who's stealing in order to change their individual behavior in a way that's cohesive to the social whole. And for Skinner, he wants to argue that we should ultimately plan for society where option two is the dominant, if not the only technique of control, rather than option one. Again, Skinner wants to see a society where we ultimately do away with coercive forms of control and more subtle and covert forms of control that's based on respect of not causing undue harm to other people. So he writes here, quote, the methods of education, moral discourse, and persuasion are acceptable not because they recognize the freedom of individuals or his right to dissent, but because they make only partial contributions to the control of his behavior. The freedom they recognize is freedom from a more coercive form of control. The dissent which they tolerate is the possible effect of other